Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I couldn't have written anything better myself, so no, that was wonderful. And then I'd like to apologise for that slide. I was trying to download the university PowerPoint slides and I seem to have downloaded the wrong one. So that is the most truly awful slide I've ever seen in my life. Thank you for inviting me here. I'm supposed to be talking about higher education institutions in social innovation ecosystems, but I'm not really keen on that question, so I thought I'll probably change the question a little bit. So I suppose I'm thinking much more around the role of the university almost as the pivot or the hub of a social innovation ecosystem. It's been my interest by accident for about 15 years now. And if we move on to the next slide. I'm not very good with technology, I'm looking for the laptop button. So, yeah, my journey, I ended up as a professor completely by accident. I always wanted to be a bus driver. No, seriously, because when I was young, we used to pay, does anybody remember cash, money? And you used to give the money to the bus driver, and they had these huge trays of money, and I always thought bus drivers must be really rich, so I thought I'd be a bus driver. Anyway, when I was about 17, I left to travel Europe. I got as far as Lorette de Mar, and I worked for a year at Rob Roy's disco bar, and that was the best year's work I ever had in my life. And then I had to find my way home at the end of the year, so I came back and I worked, at the beginning of the 1990s, I was involved with setting up the Big Issue in Manchester. At the time, I had a social conscience, which has been fully knocked out of me by universities over the last 20 years. So I worked at the Big Issue for 5 years, and it was my job to sell the magazines to the homeless people. Now, when you put that on a CV, it doesn't actually sound very good or very challenging, but it's actually really challenging selling magazines to homeless people, every single one of them. Their only goal in life was to give you less money than they actually needed, so you had to count all these 2 pennies, and my training as a bus driver came in really useful. But around 1997-98, I'm not sure if this is related, but I came to Dortmund to watch Manchester United play. And in the second leg, Dortmund knocked Manchester United out. I've never really forgiven you. But anyway, I've come back to the city and I've honoured you with my presence. But I decided I've had enough of working at the Big Issue. I was earning pretty much minimum wage, and I thought, I want to be rich now, I'm going to try and be a bus driver again. So I went to Manchester University as a mature student. I think I was about 25 at the time, and it feels funny being mature at 25. And I had a great time at Manchester. I studied sociology. I did my dissertation on homelessness and the Big Issue, and then my supervisor died, and this was probably the biggest stroke of luck I've had in my life. My new supervisor came from a more organisation studies type background, and he said, look, this is really interesting, this Big Issue thing, the tensions between social and economic goals. I thought, oh, that's a nice idea, I'll steal that. Then I got money to do a PhD, still at Manchester, around social enterprise. And by the time I finished my PhD, I thought again to myself, I never want to see a university in my life. So I went to work at Crisis, which is a homeless charity in London, where I managed the research department. After 1 year of this, I thought, universities aren't so bad, I'm going to go back to university. So I went to Birmingham University, which isn't actually on the slide, I don't think. So I went to Birmingham University, spent 5 years at an ESRC third sector research centre, where it was my job to research social enterprise. And there was nothing beyond that. I could do exactly what I wanted. It was wonderful, had a great time, met loads of people, produced loads of papers, and thought this academic life is brilliant. Then after that, Glasgow Caledonian University, they wanted to set up Eunice Centre for Social Business and Health, and somebody came and said, do I want to work there? And I thought, well, why not? So I dragged my family up to Glasgow, kicking and screaming. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Glasgow, but it's slightly further north than the North Pole, freezing all the time, and the people, you can't understand a word they say. So anyway, I stayed in Glasgow for 10 years, had a brilliant time, and now my daughter, She's got a Glaswegian accent, so we can't take her out of Glasgow because nobody else can understand her in the rest of the world. So she's still in Glasgow, but I moved to Belfast 2 years ago. It was during COVID, and you just get bored, and I fancied a change, so I went to Belfast, and I'm having a change now. Also, it was the first time I'd ever worked in a business school, and business schools are very strange places, and I'll say a little bit more about this later if I ever get past this long-winded introduction. But so they came in and they said, what can you teach? I said, well, I can teach social innovation and sustainability. And they said, well, that takes up about 5% of your time. And I said, I'm a bit stuck with your other subjects. So they said, okay, we'll make you head of department. So I've had 2 years of head of department. I made such a bad job of it that they promoted me to director of research. So now I'm director of research at Queen's Business School, which I'm very proud of. So I suppose what I wanted to do was begin to set out a vision of what a university could be if it was a social innovation hub. So I thought I'll start with some of the problems. Now, these problems are mainly in the UK, but one thing we found in higher education is the UK is leading the world. What we mess up now, you will mess up 10 years in the future. So listen closely and follow the UK way. It's going to ruin your lives as well. So in 1997, Tony Blair, New Labour, came to power, and one of his commitments was to increase the number of children going to university to 50% of the population. He almost succeeded in this, and there was a huge increase in government funding to get people into universities. We renamed all the colleges universities, which meant that college students also became university students, so that made a big difference. And as part of this, they introduced university fees, which were originally £1,000 25 years ago. They then rose to £3,000 in 2006, 2007, and in 2012 they reached £9,000. Now that's a fortune to me, who's paying my son's school fees, but it's not a lot of money to the universities because the fees have stayed stuck at £9,000 for 13 years now. Now, some people have estimated the cost of providing the average degree is £12,500. So for every undergraduate student we teach in the UK, we lose £3,500. Now that's on average. The advantage is we have business schools that can cram in huge numbers of students and we can mass produce education for them, but it's not ideal. I suppose one of the things as well, there's a discourse in higher education about it's about preparing students for the labour market. So in the UK, students should come out of university and be ready to take a job. Gone are the old days where you went to university to learn, to think creatively, to come out and then go and work in Lorette de Mar or wherever. So the world's changing and there's a push towards degrees that are useful. As well as nursing, there's a big focus on management, and I'm not quite sure how to describe it, but the old type of degrees, sociology, they're seen as, why would anybody study sociology? People look at, what are your lifetime earnings going to be if you study sociology, and people apparently make these calculations and go off and study management instead. Research more and more is focused on economic impact. Now, in the old days, the ESRC used to fund most of the research in social science in the UK, and it was wildly out of touch with what people wanted. So there's a push towards research that is much more focused on impact, but that's probably gone far too far in the wrong direction now. So for every research grant we put in the UK, you have to say, what is the economic impact going to be, or what is the policy impact? Now, for someone like me whose research is really about, in an ideal world, we would have no markets, and I'm not very keen on governments either, so I'm critical of policy. It makes it very difficult to get funded when your impact is going to be, actually, I want to destroy economic impact and critique policy. Then universities very much now, in terms of, they're into commercialising. You're brilliant at this at Dortmund. We're never going to compete in the UK. So we have university spin-outs. We sell off the IP, create companies, and it brings back money to the university this way. So more and more, there's a marketisation of higher education, And in general, I don't think it's a great thing. Now, combined with all this, we have ranking systems and metrics. So there's millions of ranking systems and metrics out there, Times Higher Education, QS World Rankings, etc. And more universities are trying to attract students through particularly foreign students who can pay higher fees. And the idea is that by pushing our way up the university rankings table, more and more students from China and Southeast Asia will come to the UK universities, spend £20,000 in fees and subsidise the domestic students. The final piece of the jigsaw is the Research Excellence Framework, which is the way of, I suppose, distributing research funding amongst UK universities. And it's a huge bureaucratic exercise that seeks to measure the value of a university's research. So every university submits for each member of staff 2.5 outputs or journal articles. These are all ranked between 0 and 4 stars. They produce 3 to 6 impact case studies per unit of assessment and a nice narrative statement saying how brilliant they are, how they're changing the world and the economic impact they're making. This takes out a huge amount of time, and surprisingly enough, it's my job to lead Queen's Business School in the next one, and I did it for Glasgow Caledonian University in the last one. I think most of this system's a joke, a game to be played, and you become quite good at playing it. But in general, it's led to competition between universities to attract students, to attract income and to rise the league tables. And there's not very many opportunities for UK universities to collaborate. European funding's different, although I'm not entirely sure that's moving in the right direction. So, signs of hope, and there's a question mark after this. So, I mentioned before, the impact agenda, I suppose pushing people towards impactful research is, in general, positive. This actual book's quite critical of the impact agenda, but not necessarily impact agenda, more the way that the whole agenda is being pushed. Then the Times Higher Education rankings, more and more now, there's millions of ranking systems, a lot of money to be made out of creating league tables, so everybody's doing it. And the Times Higher Education have brought in the impact rankings, and these are really interesting. So this is much more about ranking universities by commitments to sustainability, sustainable development goals, gender equality. At Glasgow Caledonian, about 7 years, we were absolutely delighted and quite shocked when we came second in the world for promoting gender equality. Now, my wife works in a Women in Scotland's Economy Research Institute there, and they were all up in arms running around telling everybody how brilliant they were, because it was obviously their research that had got them there. But we did some digging into how the rankings were calculated, and sadly it was nothing to do with them. It was all to do with the proportion of women who were first author on a paper. And if you had a higher proportion of women who were first author on papers, that meant you had a greater commitment to gender equality, which was great because we were dominated by nursing, which meant we were obviously going to do better than the rest of the UK. So anyway, number 2 in the world for gender equality until the other universities work out how to play the rankings. In terms of the rankings, I think there's more and more resistance to them, but not many universities actually actively resisting. So Utrecht University famously stopped providing data to the Times Higher rankings. I'm not entirely sure whether they're doing this for other ranking systems or just the Times Higher, but we are seeing more and more resistance and discourse against university ranking systems. And then in the UK, the Civic University Network, there's loads of networks like these wanting to bring together universities with the purpose of something a little bit more than rising up the league tables and attracting foreign students. So I suppose the question at the start, what I would have liked to have been asked, and so what I've asked myself because nobody did ask me, is what if universities were to become truly mission-driven? So at Glasgow Caledonian University, the mission was University for the Common Good. I've dropped the good bit out, but that's probably quite appropriate because there's a new Vice-Chancellor now and he seems to have dropped the good bit out of there anyway. And this for the common good been a mission at Glasgow Caledonian for about 150 years, since it was a college for making bread, apparently. It had largely been forgotten. Then the new principal came around and she thought, oh, this is really great. We can position ourselves as something slightly different to the other universities. And she was a brilliant vice-chancellor. I have to be very careful. I once went to America and I described her as a bucket of frogs, and it was being recorded, and she got to see the recording. Bucket of frogs probably doesn't translate well into German, does it? Right, so if you've got a bucket of frogs, then you've got all these frogs hopping about and never going anywhere, and it's completely crazy, and it's a way of saying that somebody's completely crazy. So anyway, so next time, you've all learned something today. It's been a really valuable keynote, and thanks for attending. I might as well stop now. So I said she was a bucket of frogs, and this got back to her. But at Glasgow Caledonian University, she really did have a commitment towards the common good. And staff, faculty, students all bought into this. It's a nice, simple message. It's vague enough to be almost completely meaningless. Everybody believes in the common good, just nobody can agree on what the common good should be. But as a rallying point for bringing people together, it's really useful. Now, when I went to Queen's University 2 years ago, 3 things attracted me, actually. So the first of it was there's a long tradition of social innovation research, but from much more of a social policy perspective. Then the mission statement and all the vans they have driving around Belfast, they also say shaping a better world since 1845. And I think this is wonderful because some universities' missions aren't very inspiring at all. And then the final thing that attracted me was I moved to a business school and they gave me a huge pay rise, but that doesn't really fit with the narrative of the rest of the talk, so we'll skip through that. So back to Glasgow Caledonian University. So Mohammed Yunus visited Glasgow around about 2009. He actually visited Glasgow University, but our Vice-Chancellor pinched him and took him on a tour of Glasgow. And he was shocked to see that in this apparently rich country, people were living in absolutely atrocious conditions. And he started saying to the principal, you know, hey, maybe Grameen could do something over here. And she's like, oh, yes, why don't you become our chancellor? Then we can catapult ourselves ahead in the world rankings. So over the next 10 years, he struck up a partnership with Glasgow Caledonian University that really did make a difference to Glasgow Caledonian University. But he also struck a very hard bargain as well. So, sorry, this is a terrible picture, but they don't have many pictures on the internet, so I had to dig it out of my personal ones. So one of the first things that happened was Grameen Caledonian College of Nursing was it was funded by Glasgow Caledonian, and it was a partnership with Grameen to train the daughters of Grameen borrowers to become nurses in Bangladesh. Now, at the time, nursing was a stigmatized profession because it was undertaken by women, and particularly women from the lower castes. So the idea that a prestigious, inverted commas, foreign university would invest in this made it pretty successful, at least in terms of the number of students it was attracting. After a few years, Glasgow Caledonian stepped out of the venture. It's still going in Bangladesh, and we spent a lot of money on it, but it incredibly boosted our profile. This is one of the slightly crazier ideas I've ever seen in my life. So Eunice thought, one of the problems in Scotland is you don't have enough microcredit. So he set up a partnership with Tesco Bank and Glasgow Caledonian and Grameen to offer microcredit to micro-entrepreneurs in Glasgow. So very small sums of money for people to start setting up a business. It's hugely successful at first. Lots of people were very happy to borrow money. A few years later, it went bust. There's a strong tradition in Glasgow of never paying moneylenders back. So Eunice had some dinner with him one night, and half sarcastically, but not fully sarcastically, he was saying, your big problem in Scotland is this welfare state. People aren't hungry enough to become entrepreneurs. And he was thinking maybe we could speak to the government and get them to abolish the welfare state. He might have actually managed to speak to the government because they're making a pretty good job of abolishing our welfare state at the moment. But The UNIS Centre for Social Business and Health. Yeah, that was a beautiful picture when I put it on the slides. There's only 3 people who've won the Nobel Peace Prize, the Congressional Gold Medal, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and appeared in an episode of The Simpsons. If you can guess who the other 2 are, well, I've forgotten now, so you're not going to get a prize anyway. But, so I was taken to Glasgow Caledonian University to help set up the UNIS Centre for Social Business and Health, and the idea behind this was that ordinary people just becoming involved in community activities, it might be running a football team, it might be just helping out with a school run, but all this boosts your health, not just in a physical way, but I suppose more mentally, by giving people power and control over their own lives. This could improve health. Now, Glasgow at the time had some of the worst health disparities in the world. So 2 miles away from where we used to live, the average age for a man to die was 57. Where I used to live, it was 73, just in a 2-mile distance. And this was largely down to poverty, drug abuse, social determinants of health. So there's a big push on that. So the UNIS Centre were able to tap into that. We brought in a lot of money from UK government, Medical Research Council, and had a great time for 10 years there. And then the smiley chap at the front, this is Mark Anderson, and he's the person who probably should have been speaking here today. You would have had a highly polished professional performance by Mark, but instead I'm afraid you've got me. So just after I started at Glasgow Caledonian University, the principal invited me to her office, and it turned out, we've all heard of Ashoka. So she'd met Ashoka at some event in America, and they'd said to her, "You're amazing, you're one of the great social innovators of our time." Now, one of the great things about university principals is they can't tell when people are being ironic. So anyway, she says, "Oh, I'm going to be one of the great social innovators of our time. I better do something to cement my legacy." So she called for me. This is asking for trouble, because if anybody's ever read what I'd written, they realise I wasn't the right person to ask. And she said, "We want to join Ashoka." So I said, "Okay, we'll join Ashoka." Now, Ashoka's main thing for joining is you have to fill in hundreds of forms, pay for lots of people to America to come to your university, show them round, and tell them that everything you do is social innovation. So remarkably good at that. So I rebadged everything at the university as social innovation. We had a social innovation at GCU, hashtag or whatever they're called. And Ashoka came and gave us the badge. But back to Mark. So Mark Anderson did an incredible amount at GCU over the last 10 years while I was taking the credit for it all. So he's been involved in multiple European projects. He ended up becoming Director of Research, and it was his job to reform the research infrastructure at GCU. He was absolutely terrible at that, but in terms of social innovation, developing research partnerships, he was amazing and still is. So this is Mark in, I think that's his Southeast Asian Social Enterprise Network, and then there's a Latin American Social Innovation Network. There's 2 other social innovation networks, and he was able to get European funding for all of these. Common Good First was a European project we had that it was actually, it's probably even the most crazy idea ever. So we went to South Africa, and it was about encouraging community projects in South Africa to record their thoughts into mobile phones and videos and upload these to the internet. The next stage of the idea was supposedly that academics were going to test these and say which ones were viable or not. But thankfully it stopped before that stage, and there was a beautiful project showing people's thoughts of community groups in South Africa. Other things, so when Ashoka came, everybody has a university incubation centre. Nobody had ever set foot in ours. It was a dusty broom cupboard. There was a little sign saying U-Hatch above the door, and that was it. Nobody knew where the key was. Mark managed to revitalise that by bringing in people from the local social enterprise community, and we spun out a few social enterprises, but it also became a place for the local community to come, and they were able to use it as a social enterprise incubation centre. And then other things we had going on that most universities have is we train lawyers, so we set up a law clinic in the poorest parts of Glasgow so people can go and get legal advice. We train opticians, so we set up an eye clinic, again in one of the poorest areas of Glasgow, so people can come and get eye advice. Not quite sure what eye advice is called in the technical terms. And there were loads of initiatives like these all going on, and there's some fantastic stuff going on there. So when I moved to Queen's, I suppose this is a much more research-intensive university. It's very posh, and it makes you feel a little bit special when you go through the doors. It's not like Glasgow Caledonian University. But one of the things I notice is everybody has much more time, so academics only teach 1 or 2 classes. They get lots of time for research, but they also get lots of time to develop the impact of the research. And because of the unique history of Belfast, so 25 years ago, there was the peace agreement. For 25 years before that, most people would call it a civil war in Northern Ireland. The Irish people are remarkably sanguine about this. They call it the Troubles, which sounds a little bit, something you might get in on your way home from a nightclub or something. But no, so anyway, the Troubles are over, but there's still 2 distinct communities, a sort of Irish community and a British community in Belfast. And the 2 communities, they still have walls between them, and these walls are 12 foot tall to stop people throwing petrol bombs over them. So for a university, it's really difficult to operate in these kinds of communities because you can't be seen to show favouritism to one side over the other. So the Queen's Innovation Zones are social innovation zones that are supposed to promote social innovation, and they have 2 of them. So one is Shankill, which is the big loyalist Protestant British road running through West Belfast, and and then the other one's Coin Street, which is slightly further south, and that's the big Irish area. And just after I started, they had these are all children from the Shankill schools, and they were invited to, they invited themselves actually, a bit like me coming here, and they were invited to tell stories of their hopes and aspirations. And in many ways, these hopes and aspirations would be the same in any country in the world, in a deprived city. So they talked about wanting to go on a foreign holiday, about wanting their mum to be happy. But they also talked about things that we just take for granted, that they want to be able to cross 100 yards over the street, they want peace, they want not to be frightened at nights by helicopters going around. So it's quite scary, but also quite uplifting. Anyway, so that's, and I guess the point to all this is, sorry, I always forget the point, is that this had come about through a partnership with the Shankill Community Trust, and we'd gone to them, or the Queen's had gone to them and said, what is it you want to do in terms of research? And they said, we want to tell these stories for the future. And so it would be very unlikely that the ESRC or the UK funding bodies would fund this, because at the end of the day, you've got lots of video diaries, no journal articles, nothing, just children telling their stories. Now, there's amazing things you can do with that, but it's not impact generating in the UK sense of the word, but because it's Queen's and because there's these 2 communities, you're able to go and do those kinds of things, and it's possible to do some great research there. So I put all these together and thought, all these things are going on in just 2 or 3 of the universities I've worked at. There's lots more going on in these universities that I don't know about, and there's loads more going on about in other universities around the world. And what if you're able to just run universities and focus on making the world a better place, on serving the common good, about not worrying about the number of Southeast Asian students paying £30,000 a year, or where you are in the league tables, then you might have an eye clinic, you might have a law clinic, open access to campus. So the campus isn't shut away. You invite people into the campus, you give them space, you let them use the meeting rooms, you let them use the seminar rooms. When we're not teaching, they can be given over to community groups, they can have town hall style meetings. There's loads you can potentially do there. Then the co-production of research, I think we're getting better at that all around the world, but but there are some absolutely amazing things you can do. And when you genuinely turn over research to the users, you come out with some quite powerful things that you have to work out how you're going to use yourself, but it's still worthwhile. And then the social venture incubation space, so rather than seeing university spin-outs as a way to make money for the university, most of our research is publicly funded, and if we can find ways to give this away without commercial companies capturing the value, then all the better. So if we can use social enterprise to deliver some of these, then great. Now, what I would probably do if I had a little bit more time would invite you all to go around to the room, add little bits and make this wheel bigger and bigger. And I'm a real expert with technology, so as you were saying this, I'd be typing, and by the end of it you would have a beautiful picture of the university as a social innovation hub. But sadly we're running out of time, so I'll skip that side of it. So then, if we were going to do this, how can we get there? And I suppose there's three aspects. So there's building movements for change, then pushing back against what's already happening, and then just going out and doing it and building from the bottom. And I suppose in building movements for change, there's people like yourselves involved in social innovation education. In the UK, there's networks of civic universities. There's even those strange people in America, Ashoka, who want to turn the world into a place where I don't know what Ashoka wants to do. But there's all these different people working towards similar goals, and I think need to find a way to unite those and build some kind of a movement to take higher education back towards being for the common good. Then in terms of pushing back, you can push back against all these ranking systems. So years ago, Rhodes University made a really famous statement rejecting scientifically dubious university rankings. And their reasons for doing so weren't like Utrecht in that these rankings are flawed. They were actually genuinely worried about where these rankings take us. And I think over time they've been proved right. And I suppose it's very unlikely university vice-chancellors are going to say, let's reject the university ranking systems, but the more pressure individual academics put on them to move away from ranking systems and to do research and teaching for what it's originally intended, then there is a chance to push back in the right direction. It's not just individuals and it's not just universities that can do this, but this will require bringing trade unions, etc., on side, and it's a long and difficult battle, but there's something there. And then, this actually isn't a picture of a university turns inside out or anything, but when I put it into Google, this came up and I thought, this is wonderful. So it's nothing to do with a university, but there's something about inside out. And I suppose this is just a bit sort of opening up universities to, you know, when Tony Blair tried to make sure 50% of kids went to university, even he's neglecting 50% of children at the bottom. And this is about making universities relevant to the 50% of children at the bottom of higher education. And if this is just eye clinics, law clinics, changing the way we do research, then that's better than nothing, and that's great. So these are just some of my ideas of what a university as a social innovation hub might look like, and I'll invite you to take us there. Thank you.